Welcome to the debate. Our material today takes us into some really complex territory, adolescent dating. We're sort of grappling with a dual mandate here. On the one hand, what we should be teaching young people about healthy boundaries, but on the other, the grim reality of the survival strategies they're often forced to adopt when things turn coercive.
Exactly. It's this fundamental tension between, the theoretical ideal and the immediate, often pervasive reality. Adolescence is this period of intense exploration. And of course, we want to give them the tools for negotiation, for mutual respect. But when power asymmetry enters the picture, the tools we normally champion, like compromise, open communication, they often fail, sometimes spectacularly.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our central question for anyone guiding young people. Should the primary focus be on proactively establishing clear mutual boundaries, emotional, physical, financial, as this foundational mechanism for their development? Or do we need to prioritize validating and teaching the adaptive survival strategies that we see them using when those boundaries are almost inevitably violated in high-risk contexts?
And I believe the overwhelming data on relationship violence forces our hand. We have to prioritize understanding and validating those adaptive survival strategies because, often they are the only functional path to safety.
And I'll be arguing that establishing proactive, explicit boundaries rooted in self-respect is the strongest, most foundational tool for protection and long-term health, because it equips the adolescent to recognize and hopefully avoid those toxic environments in the first place.
I see why you're focused there, but let me offer a different perspective. My position, it really rests on the developmental necessity of boundaries. Focusing on clear, explicit personal limits is, I think, the foundational mechanism for healthy adolescent growth. Our sources explicitly link rigorous boundary setting around time, physical comfort, finances, emotional responsibility to maintaining mental health.
And we all agree those are the goals, but I worry you're starting with the assumption of a good faith partner who will respect that clarity. Well, it's less about assumption and more about definition. Boundaries function like protective walls around the self. When an adolescent can define a clear, non-negotiable principle, whether it's a limit on time together or a clear sexual boundary, it instills a sense of agency. It dictates that they determine the line, not external pressure. If they have that internal clarity, they build this personal architecture that makes them far more difficult to manipulate. That internal compass, that's the bedrock of resilience.
I come at it from a different method. While explicit boundaries are the theoretical map, the empirical data on sexual dating violence, SDV, it's just too stark to ignore. We're talking 20 to 50% of adolescents affected. So focusing solely on mutual agreement, it just falls apart when coercion is present. A boundary is only functional if the person across from you respects the very concept of autonomy. In these dynamics, boundaries aren't respected. They're tested. They're exploited.
But surely, clearly articulating those boundaries is the first step, right? The first step toward recognizing a violation, which then helps the young person exit the relationship or disclose the abuse?
You're right that it helps with identification, but the challenge isn't recognition. It's implementation. Exit and disclosure are often, they can feel impossible, especially if a young person lacks resources or fears the social fallout. The research is clear here. The most dominant strategy used by adolescent victims of STB is withdrawal, just silence, avoidance, emotional disengagement. And this withdrawal, it isn't a passive failure to communicate. It is a highly calculated, functional, survival-oriented tactic. It's used to minimize immediate harm, to conserve the immense emotional energy it takes to navigate abuse, and to reclaim tiny fragments of control where overt assertion would just provoke retaliation. If we don't acknowledge the function of this behavior, we risk pathologizing a rational, self-preserving response. So we have to prioritize reframing strategies like withdrawal, often labeled maladaptive, as adaptive acts of survival.
That's an interesting point about immediate harm, though. I would frame it differently when we think about long-term development. Beyond just survival, adolescence is critically about learning to move past shallow feelings, what our source calls Cinta Monyet, or monkey love, and toward functional relationships that offer real emotional learning.
And that deeper learning requires fundamental safety, which is precisely what's missing in these situations.
I understand the risks, but the skill development itself is crucial for any complex adult relationship. We're talking about positive problem solving, open communication, negotiation, compromise. If we teach adolescents that their first line of defense is to withdraw, we deny them the chance to develop the skills they need for healthy relationships later. We risk setting them up for failure in non-abusive contexts because they never learned how to healthily resolve conflict.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that as the primary goal when we know so many are navigating coercion. Let me tell you why that approach is so dangerous in a high-risk scenario. The studies show that in SDV contexts, when victims attempted positive problem solving, their efforts were consistently dismissed, manipulated, or just invalidated. These attempts at communication, they didn't work as tools for resolution. They just served as a test of the partner's willingness to respect them, a test that, failed almost immediately. And worse, promoting open communication first can inadvertently burden the victim with self-blame when it doesn't work. The abuser just gaslights them, saying, "If only you had tried harder to explain." So the tool designed for mutual growth becomes a weapon in the hands of an abuser.
That points then not away from boundaries, but to the necessity of establishing clear emotional boundaries first. The ultimate solution to manipulation lies in internal regulation. Adolescents have to internalize that they are not responsible for their partner's feelings or actions. They have to prioritize self-love over obsession or complete reliance on the relationship for their self-worth. We have to teach them to shift from impulsive reactions, like lashing out or immediately withdrawing without a plan, to intentional responses. Emotional regulation, developed through things like journaling or just self-reflection, is cited as the key. That internal work allows them to define their non-negotiables, and that intentionality is what enables assertive boundary setting before or right after the first transgression.
That's a compelling argument for the long-term goal, but have you considered the immediate, immense strength of emotional dependence? Our material highlights that dependence, this overwhelming fear of abandonment. Equating the relationship's survival with your own personal worth, it acts as a powerful tether that just overrides rational boundaries. It's a different kind of survival instinct, a fear of being alone.
But if we teach them their self-worth is independent of the relationship, we can mitigate that dependence.
Agreed, but dependence is the dominant initial trap, and regulation skills, they only emerge gradually. Think about the examples where victims focused exclusively on the partner, neglecting friends, family. These systematically reduce their own autonomy. Regulation skills are vital, yes, but they're often catalyzed by external support, a friend, a sibling, counseling, not just internal discipline. This means the default state for many victims is one of deep dependence, where the rational boundary setting you're championing is actively sabotaged by the terror of being abandoned. We have to address that dependence by providing external anchors, rather than just expecting them to achieve self-discipline under coercive stress.
So, if you're arguing that emotional dependence traps them and external support is the engine to overcome it, then how do you defend prioritizing withdrawal? It seems like that would only exacerbate the isolation.
But that leads us directly to the core distinction we have to make. Withdrawal is functional in that specific coercive context. It's not a developmental strategy for long-term health. It's a strategy for short-term survival.
But that is precisely my point. Withdrawal leaves conflicts unresolved, which is toxic for any relationship's long-term health. If we normalize silence in our teaching, we risk denying adolescents the chance to develop the communication skills they need for future adult relationships. The cost is their ability to find a voice when they finally enter a safe relationship. We need to encourage finding a voice, even if it's difficult.
We have to differentiate explicitly between a conflict resolution strategy and a survival tactic. The study explicitly concluded that in the context of SDV, withdrawal is the most functional strategy for the victim. It is a calculated, protective response designed to minimize immediate risk when asserting yourself just leads to verbal abuse, threats, or worse. To label this protective tactic as simply maladaptive because it fails to achieve resolution, that is to pathologize a victim's rational attempt to survive an environment designed to punish communication. We have to teach them that their refusal to engage with abuse, their silence, is a sign of strength, a conservation of spirit, and a successful negotiation for their own safety.
The function of survival is clear, I'll grant you that, but that shouldn't define our educational priority. If our primary focus is teaching survival tactics, we risk framing all dating through the lens of potential abuse, rather than focusing on the ideal structures that prevent abuse in the first place.
Leading with the reality of abuse, which affects up to half of adolescents, isn't framing it as potential, it's framing it as pervasive. We have to validate that when an adolescent is trapped, retreating and conserving energy is a rational negotiation for their safety and dignity, not a failure of communication skills. The failure rests entirely with the partner who violated the boundaries you taught them to set.
I maintain that the starting point has to be the proactive definition of clear personal boundaries. Time, emotional space, finances, physical safety. That framework instills the self-respect and agency that acts as the strongest initial protection. When an adolescent truly knows their non-negotiable limits, they are better equipped to recognize and avoid toxic situations from the start.
And while boundaries provide that essential map, we have to acknowledge the reality that many adolescents face coercion where those boundaries are immediately violated. Our guidance must prioritize validating survival-oriented strategies like withdrawal, and, as we both noted, the decisive factor in resilience is often external support. Peers, siblings, counseling, which provide a safe reference point when the core relationship is unsafe. We need to teach young people how to pivot their emotional investment to those external anchors immediately, rather than continuing to pour energy into trying to resolve conflict with an abuser.
That's a crucial point of convergence. I think both perspectives strongly agree that external support is vital for both regulation and recovery. It's the safety net that allows the internal work of boundary setting to eventually take hold.
Precisely. We empower them internally with boundaries, but we have to be ready to save them externally with a valid escape route and support network.
Ultimately, both perspectives underscore that navigating intimate relationships during adolescence requires a highly sophisticated understanding from all of us, whether the focus is on establishing proactive rules or adapting to unsafe realities.
Indeed, there's clearly much more to explore in how we equip young people for these complexities, ensuring that our ideal models never overshadow their very real need for survival.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.